Hello everyone, welcome to the 22nd lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. As you know, we are in the 9th week of this course, and in the last lecture what we have discussed the Latin American dependency school in the context of the radicalization of the ECLA tradition, I mean the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, and I mean through the works of Furtado and Sankel. I mean how much attention was paid to purely economic problems, but there was an exclusion of social and political problems, and ECLA's dependence on conservative Latin American governments precluded the use of analysis and remedies that happened to radical such as land reforms. And Furtado, so far as the radicalization of the ECLA analysis is concerned, looked at lack of capital in underdeveloped countries, mainly to external factors, I mean the periphery of exported raw materials and imported industrial goods, solution in import substitution. Furtado looked at Brazil, I mean developments leading up to the military coup in 1964, rejection of the earlier emphasis on the growth of productivity. Through economic development in Latin America, Furtado looked at capitalist development not only in the center, I mean not only in the developed countries, but also in the periphery, I mean the less developed countries. And the ECLA strategy of industrialization that increased foreign dependence, and Furtado tried to look at development through Marxism coupled with Keynesian theory. And Sankel, when we look at radicalization of the ECLA analysis, Sankel rejected revolutionary solution, I mean a radical socialist revolution in Sankel's opinion is a highly improbable historical event in the immediate future of Latin America. He emphasized on the internal factors, national development policy, vis-a-vis, I mean in relation to domestic situation, that is the gist of the radicalization of the ECLA analysis. Then we have discussed how the capitalist system operates, and this represents the developed countries, this represents the underdeveloped countries, and from these the empty spaces that you can, vacant spaces that you can look at, they constitute the periphery of transnational capitalism, and the blue one it represents the transnational core. Okay, we have discussed this. Then we have discussed the Marxist influences through the works of Cardoso and Falato, I mean sociological annex to the ECLA analysis, Latin American Institute for Social and Economic Planning, sociological and historical studies of various cases of dependency and dependency and development in Latin America, and socio-political aspects of dependency theory. And today in this lecture what we are going to do, we are going to look at the Neo-Marxist influences through the works of Dos Santos and Marini. Another Brazilian, I mean Dos Santos, had also moved to Chile after the military coup in Brazil, just like Sankel. In 1966, what he did, he introduced the term the new dependence, okay, in an attempt to explain the failure of the policy of import substitution. The new dependence was characterized by the fact that the North American investment in Latin American countries had increased as well as changed the orientation. The emphasis was shifted away from raw materials to industry, from which the most advanced and dynamic sectors such as electronics were selected. According to Dos Santos, this seemed to indicate that a new international division of labor, I mean specialization, was about to be established, in which the periphery was no longer made up of raw material exporting enclave economies. The modern sector of the entire periphery was now incorporated in the imperialist system, but the development remained partial and with no dynamics of its own because of the dependency relations. Dos Santos not only criticized the established development theories, but also offered the dependency approach as an alternative. I mean, what he meant by dependence, I mean, it is a situation in which the economy of certain countries is conditioned by the development and expansion of another economy to which the former is subjected. The relation of interdependence between two or more economies and between these and world trade assumes the form of dependence, with when some countries, I mean the dominant ones, can expand and can be self-sustaining, while other countries, the dependent ones, can do this only as a reflection of that expansion, which can have either a positive or a negative effect on their immediate development. Such a reflection, I mean, it is very important to have such reflection vis-a-vis the widening debate on the dependency theory during the 1970s. The Latin American societies could, in Dos Santos's opinion, only be studied if allowances were made for the fact that they were an integral part of the world capitalist system. To analyze the problem of development from a historical point of view, Dos Santos identified three different forms of dependence. What are those three different forms of dependence? One, colonial dependence; two, financial industrial dependence; and three, technological industrial dependence. The colonial dependence, the first one, was characterized by trade monopolies complemented by colonial monopolies of land, mines and labor in the colonized countries. The second form of dependence occurred during the later part of the 19th century and was characterized by large concentrations of capital in the developed countries and by investments in the production of raw materials and agricultural products in the less developed countries. The countries belonging to, the less developed countries developed into export economies, the structure of which was marked by their position of dependence. And the third one, the technological industrial dependence, the third form of dependence came into existence after the Second World War and was characterized by multinational corporations establishing industries that were linked to the dependent countries' domestic markets. And Dos Santos's writings are primarily related to the technological industrial dependence, which constitutes the new dependence. This is extremely important. What is the new dependence then? The technological industrial dependence for Dos Santos is the new dependence. And the new dependence was essentially an answer to the ECLA policy of import substitution as well as an attempt to demonstrate the limitations of this kind of policy, limitations of the import substitution policy. The industrialization resulting from the policy of import substitution was doomed to stagnation after a short while because of the restrictions placed by the expansion of the domestic market by dependence. And these restrictions were: first, the working class was heavily exploited, which limited its purchasing power. Secondly, the technology was capital intensive, which created relatively few jobs because of the prevalence of unskilled labor force. And thirdly, the repatriation of profits led to an extremely limited domestic surplus. Dos Santos came to the conclusion that the alleged backwardness of these economies was not caused by a lack of integration with capitalism, but rather that the most serious obstacles to their overall development were due to the international system and its laws of development. The solutions proposed by organizations such as the ECLA as well as UN were therefore insufficient. The only alternatives were, according to Dos Santos, military regimes which opened the door to fascism or revolutionary regimes which laid the foundation of socialism in, for example, in Chile. This tendency towards a polarized view between fascism on the one hand and socialism on the other, which was in no way peculiar to Dos Santos, was presumably a result of the fact that most of the dependency theorists came from either Brazil or Chile. According to Dos Santos, the concept of dependence could not be formulated outside the boundaries of the theory of imperialism. This is very important, theory of imperialism. I mean, Lenin suggested that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. Okay? When I said the concept of dependence according to Dos Santos could not be formulated outside the boundaries of the theory of imperialism, but should be seen as a complement to the term imperialism, since dependency is the internal face of imperialism in Latin American countries. A dependency theory was therefore needed as a complement to the theory of imperialism, and the theory of imperialism should analyze the factors behind the internationalization of capitalism, whereas the dependency theory should demonstrate the effects of this process in the relevant countries, maybe in Latin American countries, maybe in African countries, maybe in Asian countries, and so on. And Dos Santos later abandoned such definition of dependence and attached greater importance to the internal structures, just like Sankel. Dos Santos emphasized the fact that the internal characters, determined social changes. However, dependence created the prerequisites for the development of internal structures, and the relation between the external and the internal factors was considered as dialectic. Okay? That is why we very often say that the distinction between the external and internal factors is not rigid but porous, and the demarcation between external and internal factors is naive, and so on. Similarly, you will find Marini was also a member of the group of Brazilians working in Chile. He was primarily engaged in the formulation of a model that could explain how capitalism at the global level could simultaneously generate development in one part of the world and underdevelopment in another. Marini made a strong distinction between dependent or peripheral capitalism and the form of capitalism found in the centers. The development of peripheral capitalism was conditioned by that of the development of capitalism in the more advanced capitalist countries. This form of dependence led to a transfer of surplus from the peripheral countries to the center, from the less developed countries to the more advanced capitalist nations. The peripheral economies were, according to Marini, dominated by foreign capital, the production of which was primarily intended for export, and this implies that in these countries the firm's realization of profits was basically dependent on the or was basically independent of the domestic demand, primarily determined by the workers' wages. In this way, the worker's role was limited to that of producing as cheaply as possible, which in turn meant that their wages could be pressed down. However, the firms must be able to realize their profits somewhere, and this was done in the center, where wages had been able to rise more than they would have done without the relations with the periphery. According to Marini, both workers and capital owners in the center had a common interest in maintaining their contacts with the periphery in a way that enabled them to continue exploiting the economic surplus. Marini introduced the concept of super exploitation in order to explain the process of exploitation in the less developed countries, which was made possible by the fact that domestic demand was of little importance to the firm's realization of their profits. The low wages led to the eventual stagnation of the small domestic market, with an economic crisis as the inevitable result. When Marini analyzed the development in Brazil by means of this model, he developed another concept which became central to the dependency school, namely that of sub-imperialism. Okay, this is important. Okay, Marini used this term sub-imperialism in an attempt to translate Lenin's imperialism to a dependent capitalism. Thus, sub-imperialism was supposed to be the highest stage of dependent capitalism. Okay, when Lenin said imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, perhaps he was referring to the imperialism as being pursued or practiced by the center, by the most advanced capitalist nations. And Marini's concept of imperialism, Marini's concept of sub-imperialism was supposed to be the highest stage of dependent capitalism. Capitalism as being pursued or practiced in the less developed countries. And this leads us to the crystallized theory of dependence through the works of Andre Gunder Frank. Andre Gunder Frank, as you know, joined the circle of Latin American dependency during the mid 1960s, and he soon became one of the driving forces behind the early development of the dependency school. He became internationally known for his critique of the established development theory propounded by the modernization paradigm, and at the same time he served as a link between the Latin American debate and the English speaking academic world by publishing most of his works in English. And at this point it should be mentioned that outside Latin America, the dependency school has been more or less identified with Andre Gunder Frank. Frank was one of the first in Latin America to work with an alternative theory of the Latin American economic development. The earliest results from this attempt were presented in Capitalism and Underdevelopment in Latin America, published in 1969, and in this book, which was an analysis of the economic history of Brazil and Chile, he came to the conclusion that development and underdevelopment are two sides of the same coin. Thus, according to Frank, it was the incorporation into the world capitalist system that led to development in some areas and underdevelopment in others. Following Paul Baran, who introduced the concept of economic surplus, actual surplus, and distinction between actual surplus and potential surplus, Andre Gunder Frank stressed that it was the utilization of the economic surplus that had caused development and underdevelopment. Frank's analysis accentuated the monopolistic structure of capitalism and its effects on the real and the potential surplus, actual and potential surplus. The world capitalist system was characterized by a metropolis satellite structure, where the metropolis exploited the satellite. While this had facilitated the expropriation of large portions of the underdeveloped countries' actual surplus or real surplus, it had also prevented these countries from realizing their potential surplus. The monopoly structure was found at all levels, that is at the international level, at the national level, the regional level, at the local level, and also created a situation of exploitation which in turn caused the chain like flow of the surplus from the remotest Latin American villages to even the most developed nations. Okay? This is a chain type system. What Frank wrote in Capitalism and Underdevelopment in Latin America of 1969, that the monopoly capitalist structure and the surplus expropriation and appropriation contradiction run through the entire Chilean economy, past and present. Indeed, it is this exploitative relation which in chain-like fashion extends the capitalist link between the capitalist world and national metropolises to the regional centers, part of whose surplus that they appropriate, and from those to local centers and so on to large landowners or merchants who expropriate surplus from small peasants or tenants, and sometimes even from these latter to landless laborers exploited by them in turn. At each step you will find, at each step you will find along the way that the relatively few capitalists above exercise monopoly power over the many below, and expropriating some or all of their economic surplus, and to the extent that they are not expropriated in turn by the still fewer above them appropriating it for their own use. Thus, at each point the international, national and local capitalist system generates economic development for the few and underdevelopment for the many. The satellite tended to be increasingly dominated by the metropolis as well as increasingly dependent upon it. If you look at this figure, the strength of this dependency relation might, however, vary from time to time. A weakening might occur when the metropolis experiences crisis, such as Great Depression, depressions, war, economic change, transition and so on. And some development had also begun in the satellites during such periods, at the time of war, at the time of riots, at the time of economic transition and so on, which was why Frank asserted that the weaker of the metropolis satellite relations, the better the development prospects of the satellites. This is how Frank's metropolis satellite structure or model. M stands for world metropolis, capital M stands for the world metropolis, small m stands for only metropolis, and S, small s stands for satellite. There was another important contradiction of capitalism according to Frank, the contradiction of continuity in change. Here Frank argues that the basic structure of capitalism that had remained unchanged since the 16th century despite all changes. The development of underdevelopment that had taken place in the periphery, in the less developed countries, in the colonies, had continuously accentuated the fundamental contradiction, and this was why development strategies such as those formulated by the ECLA were totally meaningless. Frank's theory can be summarized through this model. I am borrowing this from Blomstorm and Hetney's book on development theory in transition, the dependency debate and beyond third world responses. The metropolis satellite relations, which are found at all levels of world capitalism, which are found at all stages of the world metropolis, are shown by the lines drawn between the circles. These lines, these lines, they are very important. A split circle shows that an agent may act as both a metropoly as well as a satellite, depending on the perspective from which you look at the circle. The process of exploitation starts at the bottom of the figure, okay, and where the landless laborers, I mean the satellites, are exploited by the by the small landowners. In this relation, the small landowners act as agents of the metropolis and can thus appropriate part of the surplus. However, they cannot keep all of it. Some of it flows up through the system, since the small landowners are exploited by the large landowners and traders, and in this relation assume the role of satellites. New metropoles are found at higher levels in the hierarchy, and in turn they exploit the large landowners and the traders, who now become satellites. Thus, the economic surplus flows upward in the system in a chain like fashion until it eventually reaches the world metropolis, that is capital M, that is the world metropolis. In other words, a comprehensive view about world capitalism and the fact that the world capitalist system embraces the entire economy of each member country were, according to Frank, important prerequisites. Thereby, Frank rejected the notion of dualism, an economy consisting of two separate unconnected sectors, one modern and the other traditional. He even went so far as to deny that feudal production relations have ever prevailed in Latin America during its colonial history. Instead, Frank assumed that an all-embracing integrated world capitalist system existed even during the mercantilist phase of capitalism. This was explained by the fact that the primary purpose of the economy founded in Latin America by the newly arrived Spaniards and Portuguese was to produce goods for export, which in Frank's opinion did not constitute a feudal economy. The implications of this view are important for the political strategy, since there were no feudal, semi-feudal or other pre-capitalist modes of production present in Latin America. There was no reason for organizations of the left to support a bourgeois democratic revolution. All efforts should instead be directed towards a socialist revolution, according to Frank. It may be argued that Frank's writings gave the dependency theory a paradigmatic form, and this is how, if the latter, I mean, we mean that the theory could now be expressed in a small number of theses that were contrary to established ideas, while at the same time they seem to be in better agreement with the reality of the third world, was the prevailing orthodoxy in development theory. Now, coming to the essence of the dependency perspective, there is a great deal of confusion about what the dependency school actually represented and about what it really said about the concrete effects of dependence, the relative importance of external and internal factors, and so on. Consequently, the critique of the dependency school, to which school has often been sweeping and unfair. It is quite natural for the object of the critique to react by not recognizing herself or himself by considering it to be a caricature. For example, Cardoso made this kind of reaction that the most general and formal Gunder Frank's works are received as though they were his best. The formal definition of dependency furnished by Dos Santos is appended. The problematic of sub-imperialism and marginality is sometimes inserted. One or another of my works or of Sankel is footnoted, and the result is a theory of dependency, a straw man easy to destroy. Okay. Cardoso's reaction is understandable. The theoretical positions taken up by the representatives of the dependency school are far from being as homogeneous and unequivocal as the critic might lead one to believe. Nevertheless, after a relatively thorough examination of the majority of the dependency school's theoretical contributions, it is not difficult to understand the critics either. since the various advocates of the dependency school group themselves differently depending on the issue, it is almost impossible to provide a systematic account of its theoretical positions. Most of the suggested classifications have one common flaw, I mean one dimensionality. Why I am telling you that one dimensionality, although all these approaches are relevant in their own ways, a comparison between them shows that different criteria of classification may lead to quite different conclusions about the role of dependency theory. It is therefore necessary to construct a multidimensional scheme in which the various criteria are made explicit, and Blomstorm and Hetney have used 6 dimensions which enable them to sum up the various views of dependency theorists in a more nuanced way. 1. Holism versus particularism. 2. External versus internal. 3. Economic versus socio-political analysis. 4. Sectoral or regional contradictions versus class contradictions, and 5. Underdevelopment versus development, and 6. Volunteerism versus determinism. We will go one by one. Okay? Before moving on to the critiques of dependency theory in the next week. Along this dimension, I mean holism and holism versus particularism, along this dimension we locate we are trying to discuss here, we are trying to locate the authors who produce global models, the dynamics of which are determined by the system in its entirety, rather than by processes in the various parts of the system. Others construe an overall perspective from the constituent parts. In his critique of the modernization perspective, Frank used the term or used the concept of holism as a specific criterion by means of which he rejected the bourgeois theory of development. Frank stressed that underdevelopment in a particular country can only be understood when it is seen as an effect of that country's position and function in the larger system of which it is an integral part. This holistic ambition eventually leads to an analysis of the global accumulation of capital of the type carried out by Frank and later on Marini. Marini recently passed away in 2018, and Sankel's model of transnational capitalism is characterized by a similar holistic ambition. Here it is also found that we also find a dynamic which determines the way in which the whole system works. It might be called structural dualism at the global level, and other dependency theorists have narrowed down their analysis to the dependent societies, mostly less developed countries, and refrained from global approaches. For example, Dos Santos and Marini. If you look at Dos Santos and Marini, Neo-Marxist influences we have discussed, that who both try to develop a special theory about peripheral capitalism, and to Cardoso and Faleto, who saw the dependency approach as a method of a concrete analysis of the periphery. Okay? That is why one might argue in favor of a world system theory as a breakaway group of the dependency school and the establishment of a distinct theoretical tradition. That is why Blomstorm and Hetney said that an attraction towards holism, that is an accentuation of the whole, was characteristic of the dependency school, even though its analysis primarily concerned the particularistic periphery, the Latin American continent. Coming to the second structural dualist position, that external versus internal, it is a question of what really governs development in a peripheral economy, external or internal factors. External factors lie outside the domain of the national economy, and internal ones refer to domestic causal relations. It is a popular misconception that the dependency school explained underdevelopment by the external factors only, that is the imperialist capitalist penetration. Theoretically, figuring out how external and internal conditions interact has in fact been one of the dependency school's main problems, to which a number of more or less elegant solutions have been found. The notion of external conditions mechanically determining internal ones is tied to Frank's earlier writings, above all to the controversial metropolis satellite model, in which dependency traces a path from Wall Street to the remotest Indian villages. The concept of satellite suggests a total lack of own dynamics. It is significant that the use of this concept has been limited and that the more neutral conceptual pair center periphery has been used instead. Although Frank occasionally warned against a mechanical externalistic interpretation of this model, that trap is difficult to avoid because of the structure of the model. However, it should be remembered that during the mid 1960s, the dependency approach had a sharp polemic sting directed at the then prevailing evolutionist theory of development, which disregarded international relations and claimed that the development of the national economy was basically internally determined. The polemic exaggerations were soon abandoned. In Dos Santos' writings, there is a tendency towards seeing the interaction between external as well as internal factors, although the external factors were more dominant. In a controversy with Andre Gunder Frank, Dos Santos says about underdevelopment that it, rather than being one of satellization, is a case of the formation of a certain type of internal structure conditioned by international relations of dependence. In a, Dos Santos goes one step further and provides a distinction between conditioning and determining factors. Conditioning means external factors and determining means internal factors, and such distinction may not be particularly informative, but it suggests that the emphasis has been shifted from the external to the internal factors. For example, Sankel also tries to steer clear of the Scylla and the Charybdis, the devil and the deep blue sea, in between the two horns of a dilemma, and sees the dialectic relation between the external and the internal. Nevertheless, as in the case of Dos Santos, distinction between the conditioning and the determining factors, it is doubtful whether the concept of dialectic leads us one step closer to a distinct idea of the relationship between the external on the one hand and the internal on the other. Cardoso is obviously more inclined to emphasize internal factors. If you look at the analysis made by Cardoso as well as Faleto, the response to the external impulse varied because the class alliances varied from country to country. Furtado's point of view is quite similar. He accentuates the rigid colonial structures in his explanation of Brazil's failure to achieve a self-generating growth. Augustine Cueva offers the most internalistic view. What he said, Cueva, that dependency theory holds that the nature of our social formations is dependent on how they are integrated with the world capitalist system. But is it not more correct to state the inverse? Is it not the nature of our societies that determines its links with the capitalist world? Such statement puts Cueva firmly in the Marxist camp rather than in the dependency school. It was thus characteristic of the latter to place a greater or lesser amount of importance on the external factors, the dependency school. Coming to the third structural dualist position, that economic analysis versus socio-political analysis, that certain authors of the dependency school work exclusively with economic analysis, whereas others emphasize social and political conditions. Normally, such difference can be explained by the author's disciplinary origin. The difference is nevertheless important to the result of the analysis. The early dependency analysis were mostly carried out by economists, while the contributions from other branches of the social sciences were relatively few. This explains the strong economic orientation which was particularly pronounced in the earlier ECLA studies. Raoul Prebisch, for instance, never really abandoned the purely economic analysis. Sankel wanted to, but never managed it. In this context, Furtado is interesting. From having been a conventional ECLA economist, he gradually began to emphasize socio-political aspects. If you look at Gunder Frank and Dos Santos, their formulations of the problems of dependence are based on the interaction between different economies. They dutifully include some references to class structure and political conditions. In true Neo-Marxist spirit, they analyze development and underdevelopment as a consequence of the flow of the economic surplus in the metropolis satellite model. Their view of political alternatives is rather simplified. Socialism or fascism. Fascism was seen in the context of Brazil and socialism was seen in the context of Chile, and they constitute binaries. Okay. This is partly in turn due to the fact that the dependency theorists are mostly Brazilians or Chileans, and partly because Brazil and Chile symbolized the alternatives of socialism and fascism during a strategic period in the history of the dependency school. The dependistas, who are called the dependistas, the proponents of the dependency theory, are often accused of neglecting class analysis, which might not only be due to their thinking in terms of models, but also to a certain bias towards economics. The use of concepts such as class consciousness and class struggle, which is quite common, it does not constitute an analysis of the political dynamics of dependent structure. Although Cardoso and Faleto do emphasize both social structure and political conditions, their approach is limited by the fact that their interest is mainly in the government and the political process of decision making, and not so much in the great mass of Latin Americans who are the real victims of underdevelopment. Cardoso later acknowledged this flaw. What Cardoso said, let me quote Cardoso here. To Cardoso, what is important is to try to understand and encourage social forces to counterbalance the power of private enterprise and the political presence of the armies in countries where the armies are politically important. Cardoso is thinking of popular movements and grassroots kinds of reaction. What kind of party movement can mobilize people in this kind of society? The problem of development cannot remain restricted to a discussion about input substitution, not even to a debate on different strategies for growth in terms of export or non-export policies, internal or external markets, orientation of the economy and so on. The main issue is people's movements and consciousness of their own interests. In other words, Cardoso uses a broad interdisciplinary approach, a historical structural analysis as he calls it, which considers both structural determination and historical change. Even if underdevelopment is determined by a given structure, the process is, in Cardoso's opinion, not mechanical but dialectic, containing dynamics, changes and alternatives. Coming to the fourth one, sectoral or regional contradictions versus class contradictions. While some authors accentuate the fact that a regional or sectoral polarization occurs in the total system, both at the international level as well as at the national level, Others base their analysis on the fact that the fundamental conflict is found in class contradictions. In other words, these authors seek the dynamics in the class struggle. For example, Marxists often criticize the dependency school for its lack of class analysis. The contradictions in Frank's metropolis satellite model were primarily regional. Despite several attempts at modification, the impression of regions opposing each other in some kind of exploitative relationship remains. In Frank's opinion, the Latin American bourgeois is incapable of starting a process of accumulation and unconscious of its own needs and interests. And such class analysis is furthermore restricted to the bourgeois, the lumpen bourgeois, which from a Marxist point of view disqualifies it, since class must be thought of as a concept that implies relations. Relations of what? Relations of production. Okay. Marini's analysis, for instance, also rests on regional contradictions. He claims that capitalists and workers jointly exploit the periphery. Looking at Sankel's approach, we find that he emphasizes, Marini emphasizes the sectoral contradictions between the transnational sector and the underdeveloped economy. This contradiction is dominant with an inhibitive effect on class consciousness and class struggle. Cardoso tries to carry out a class analysis, but in a rather complicated and diffused fashion, which seems to annoy those who are used to the primary contradiction between labor and capital as factors of production. Cardoso claims that the class structure which developed in Western Europe is basically different from the class structure which developed in, for example, in Brazil, and that a priori it is impossible to say which is progressive and which is reactionary. The components of his analysis are not the classes, but the structural relationships between various social groups. Coming to the fifth structural dualist position, that talks about underdevelopment versus development. Dependency theory is often used synonymously with theory of underdevelopment and to certain representatives of the dependency school. Development is totally incompatible with any kind of dependence. Here again, we find Frank representing the most extreme view, development of underdevelopment, while the opposite view is held by those who are close to classical Marxism. It should be pointed out that by development in this context we mean capitalist development. The question then is capitalism possible in the periphery, in the less developed countries? To Marx and Engels, this was a matter of course almost equivalent to a natural law, a position from which a Marxist can only stray with some difficulty. Cardoso claims that capitalist development in the less developed countries is possible, but limited to what he calls dependent capitalist development or associated dependent development. Okay. Cardoso's historical structuralism implied a dialectic view of development as a process of containing changes and alternatives. Somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, for example, Sankel and Dos Santos, especially Dos Santos, who rejected Frank's theory of development, of underdevelopment, and claims that it is necessary to realize that development and dependence might in certain situations be expected. Sankel's approach is a little pessimistic in the sense that he sees underdevelopment as a long inevitable process that threatens large parts of the periphery. When I say large parts of the periphery, I mean large parts of the less developed countries with marginalization and stagnation. Nevertheless, it should be pointed out that it is certain structural segments of the countries of the periphery that are being underdeveloped, not the countries per se. As opposed to the center, these peripheral segments are of such a magnitude that they affect the entire national economies. Coming to the last structural dualist position, volunteerism versus determinism, the various representatives of the dependency school have all taken great care to keep their analysis politically relevant, and the majority of them are all advocates with advocates of a rather loosely defined socialist revolution. The popularity of the dependency school can partly be explained by the growing impatience with the defeatism of the Latin American communist parties. The official Marxist analysis stated that the Latin American countries must develop from feudalism to capitalism, and consequently the communist party's strategy consisted in supporting progressive bourgeois parties striving for a national industrial capitalist development and in fighting the alliances between feudal and imperialist forces. The Neo-Marxist views, which claimed that Latin America was already capitalist but doomed to underdevelopment, provided an entirely different basis for a political strategy. That is what I mean, that was the typical attitude that revolution now and the Cuban revolution had led the way. The very dependency school, primarily Frank, I mean, is thus associated with a volunteerist line which was sharply contrasted with the Communist Party's determinism. Other dependists, other proponents of dependency theory like Cardoso are found somewhere between these two extremes, between volunteerism on the one hand and determinism on the other. And for example, if you look at Debre as well as Che and others, you will find that Cardoso accuses the Latin American Marxists of determinism and Debre and Guevara Che of volunteerism. However, this differentiated view elicits a political ambiguity which is annoying to some. Further down the deterministic line that we find in Sankel, whose markedly structuralist approach rarely reaches the actual social groups and their political situation. Politically, Sankel advocated a reformism which is close to social democracy. From this discussion, it should be possible to construct an ideal typical dependency position which, whatever relevance it might have in reality, does express a certain internal consistency. For example, a typical dependency position in terms of methodology would stress holism, external factors, economic analysis, sectoral or regional contradictions, polarization between development and underdevelopment, also socio-political analysis and so on, and the role of subjective factors in history. Generally, we might say that those who are consistently identified with the left antipole of the scheme assume a typical dependency position. Such a position can be summarized like this, that the most important obstacles to development were not capital or entrepreneurial skills, but were found to be or rather have been found in the international division of labor. In short, they were external to the underdeveloped country, not internal. Secondly, such international division of labor was analyzed in terms of relations between regions of which two kinds, more developed, more advanced capitalist nations on the one hand and the less developed countries on the other, assumed particular significance since a transfer of surplus took place from the less developed countries to the more advanced capitalist nations. Owing to the fact that the periphery was, the less developed countries were deprived of their surpluses, which the center could utilize instead for development purposes, development in the more advanced capitalist nations somehow implied underdevelopment in the less developed countries. Thus, development and underdevelopment could be described as two aspects of a single global process. and all regions participating in this process were consequently considered capitalist, although a distinction was made between capitalism as being pursued in the more advanced capitalist nations on the one hand, and capitalism being pursued in the less developed countries. That is why it is the distinction was made between central capitalism on the one hand and peripheral capitalism on the other. Since the periphery was doomed to underdevelopment because of its linkage with the center, it was considered necessary for a country to disassociate itself from the world market and strive for self-reliance. Okay? To make this possible, a more or less revolutionary political transformation was necessary. As soon as the external obstacles had been removed, development as a more or less automatic and inherent process was taken for granted. Then what we have discussed in this week in terms of 2 lectures, in the 9th week in terms of 2 lectures, we have discussed the Latin American dependency school, the radicalization of the ECLA analysis through the works of Furtado and Sankel by making explicit reference to Sankel's model of global dualism. If you look at this through the capitalist system, we have developed countries as well as underdeveloped countries, and how the periphery of transnational capitalism as well as the transnational core, they are getting forced. And then we have discussed how much attention was paid to purely economic problems, social and political problems were excluded. ECLA's dependence on conservative Latin American governments precluded the use of analysis and remedies that appeared too radical, such as land reforms. Then we have discussed Furtado's reflections on the radicalization of the ECLA analysis, lack of capital in underdeveloped countries mainly to external factors, the periphery exported raw materials and imported industrial goods, solution in import substitution, rejection of the earlier emphasis on the growth of productivity in the context of military coup in Brazil in 1964, capitalist development not only in the center but also in the periphery. And then we have discussed ECLA's strategy of industrialization, increased of foreign dependence through economic development of in Latin America. Furtado tried to combine Marxism with Keynesianism. Then we have discussed the way Sankel went ahead with rejection of revolutionary solution. A radical socialist revolution, in Sankel's opinion, is a highly improbable historical event in the immediate future of Latin America. He emphasized on internal factors. What is the gist of the ECLA radicalization of the ECLA analysis? National development policy vis-a-vis domestic situation. And then we have discussed Sankel's model of global dualism, transnational integration and national disintegration. Then we have discussed in this week Marxist influences through the works of Cardoso and Faleto, sociological annex to the ECLA analysis, Latin American Institute for Social and Economic Planning, sociological and historical studies of various cases of dependency and development in Latin America, and socio-political aspects of dependency theory. And then we have discussed, particularly in this lecture, we have discussed Neo-Marxist influences through the works of Dos Santos and Marini, interdependence between 2 or more economies and between these and world trade. 3 different forms of dependence we have discussed: colonial dependence, financial industrial dependence, as well as technological industrial dependence. We have discussed theory of imperialism, sub-imperialism through the works of Marini, emphasis on internal structures, through the works of Dos Santos, dominance of foreign capital, and so on. And then we have discussed the crystallized theory of dependence through the works of Gunder Frank, metropolis satellite structure, development of underdevelopment, and contradiction of continuity in change through this Frank's metropolis satellite model, where the capital M represents the world metropolis the small m represents metropolis, small s represents satellite. And then we have discussed the essence of the dependency perspective from 6 structural dualist positions, namely holism versus particularism, external versus internal factors, economic analysis versus socio-political analysis, sectoral and regional contradictions versus class contradictions, underdevelopment versus development, and volunteerism versus determinism. In the next week, I mean in the 10th week, okay, I mean we have come to the closer of the ninth week, okay. In the 10th week, in terms of 2 lectures, we are going to foreground the critiques of the dependency theory, I mean the neoclassical reaction, development versus underdevelopment, I mean the Marxist critique, and at the crossroads the debate among the dependencies, I mean the proponents of dependency theory. Thank you.